Hello everyone, I'm Lou Zaccarella, a founder of the Intelligent Community Forum with a special episode of No Place But Home, our look at communities and related issues during the time of COVID-19. I'm recording this from New York City today. It is April 29th. It has been 48 days since the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. We remember that the late Dr. Li in Wuhan posted his blog on December 30th. There are 217,000 dead globally as of last night at 10 o'clock p.m. There have been 59,955 deaths in the United States, 27,359 in Italy, with the second greatest number of COVID deaths. In Canada, there have been 2,859 deaths as of last night, with over half occurring in the province of Quebec. There was a slight uptick in national cases on Monday. In New York State, where I live, the total daily number of coronavirus deaths was 330 yesterday, down from 474 on April 22nd. Of note, 28 school teachers have died of the COVID disease in New York City. Total cases in the United States exceeded 1 million as of yesterday. Anthony Tomasini, a music critic here in New York, recently wrote about an odd, poignant spectacle that he'd witnessed in March, one that he referred to as the sound of no hands clapping, where dedicated musicians, and I'm quoting, donned costumes or tuxedos to perform for people at home. It felt as if music had entered a new realm with a new bond between artists and audiences, temporary for sure, but with implications for a future beyond the pandemic. We are living in the era of a pandemic, and as Dan Doctorow said recently, we are all increasingly wary of the public realm. I thought Tomasini's remarks, poetic as they were sort of appropriate for what we want to talk about today, in that they represent something that is jarringly new for us and takes us completely away from the physical familiar to where we are today. As we know, spatial distancing is the new normal. Urban designers, planners, and architects are all kind of scratching their heads about what to do, both in this phase and in the phase that our governor in New York, Andrew Cuomo, calls the reimagining phase to come. While the economic climate is uncertain, the future will arrive, and it may not rhyme, it may repeat. So we can look to the past, but few human beings do not seem to really understand the lessons of history, except urban planners and designers and intelligent community forum types. So we've brought all of them together today. And what we thought we would do is to bring together people in this general realm, call it the people who make home home, to talk about design planning, resilience ideas, and strategies. So we'll ask questions like, is density now dead? Or has it taken on a wicked viral load? So we're calling this mini-series the new abnormal. And today we'll be discussing the reduction of health risks and actions for urban planning during this crisis. What are the impacts in the public realm? So to help us, we've brought together Joe Berridge, who's a partner at Urban Strategies and the author of The Perfect City. Welcome, Joe.
Welcome.
We have Luigi Ferrara, the Dean for the Center for Arts, Design, and Information Technology for the Institute Without Boundaries, George Brown College in Toronto. Welcome, Luigi. We have Ibrahim, we'll call him Ibi, he's allowed us, Almufti, the Risk and Resilience Leader for the ARUP Group in San Francisco. He is based in San Francisco. The ARUP Group, I believe, is based in the UK. And we welcome Ibi here today. And of course,
Lou, sorry to interrupt. It's actually Ibi Almufti, not Ibi. Yeah, not Ibi, it's Ibi.
Ibi, I apologize.
That's okay.
So we welcome Ibi here, and I stand corrected. And of course, my colleague John Young, who is a fellow co-founder of the Intelligent Community Forum, and also an urban planner by trade, and I think you've even got a degree. So you are among the brethren here. And I'm going to, we've got a group of Canadians here, which is great. And I'm going to turn it over now to my favorite Canadian, my friend John Young, to kind of help explain what the goal is of this series over the next 50 minutes or so. So, John, over to you.
Well, thanks, Lou, and welcome everybody. Thanks to Joe, Edie, and Luigi for participating in this first of our series, looking at the communities, particularly the intelligent communities, and how they're faring through this COVID-19 era. As you said, Lou, yes, we're all a bit wary of the public realm, and we're also a little bit wary of the built form that seems to exist right now. How do you actually do spatial distancing? How do you create the level of comfort and understanding by people that there is a possibility of getting back together again and doing things? How do we go to the theater? How do we go to restaurants after this is over with? We're told that there's going to be a second wave, maybe even a third wave. And where's that comfort level? So what we're going to do today is begin the conversation, and it'll, of course, go on into other parts of the series over the next couple of months. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about things like, what do you do with the streets that are empty right now? Are the shops going to open up, and are people going to be coming back? What are we going to do with that low-level retail when they're all boarded up? That's not part of the streetscape that the planners and architects and urban designers had in mind. What about the opportunities for creating better density? Some people call it good versus bad density. I've heard others refer to it as the forgotten density of some people, and those sort of ethical issues of ethical densities. And what about creating really cool new areas for people to walk, to bike, maybe to go back into the cafes, but outside, maybe even have theater and music outside? What is the next period going to look like? Planners tend to have the vision that looks to the future. And we thought we'd get some planners and urban designers and resilience experts to give us a little bit of an overview of what they think is going to happen post-COVID. Back to you, Lou.
Thanks, John. Well, really the way we're going to break this down is, as John said, sort of the near term, what is happening now? How can we respond to the crisis at hand and help our cities, intelligent or otherwise, function? And then let's try to see if those things that we're doing near term might have long-term triggers for reimagining the spaces that we call home, and of course building a sense of resilience. Joe, I'm gonna start with you. Social distancing has become a way of life now. Is there something that in the short term you see as being implemented where the social distance doesn't become what I refer to as unsocial distance? Is there something that you've been thinking about?
I mean, I think it's interesting just getting up and walking around in the city that you see that protocols are developing about how you separate yourself when you're coming across the street. And it's almost like a rather sort of genteel dance that you get into of everybody breaking their strides slightly to wait for the people in front and go out. Now, this is, I just walked down Bloor Street, which is one of our big east-west avenues here in Toronto. Normally an absolute thriving, hiving street full of restaurants and street activity. And it's fascinating to begin to see, here are all those little restaurants serving people through their front windows. There's beginning to be a little bit of sort of spring shoots of activity, and people are figuring out how that's all going to happen. Mark you, this is with absolutely no pedestrian load at all, and once those pedestrian loads start to get up, I'm not sure how this is going to work. I mean, it's interesting to me that we in Toronto, at least, I don't know how it is in New York or San Francisco, but in Toronto, we are probably 3 weeks behind the Europeans, just in terms of when our peaking pattern was. So they're beginning to get out already. Everybody's talking about the Swedes, but it's also interesting to see how, you know, the Germans and Austrians and others are beginning to relax. I think we're just going to have to almost try this out. I mean, I'm in a lucky situation of, you know, I've got a job, my family's grown up, so I don't have to worry about all those fundamentals. I do get very anxious. I can see it in my kids, you know, with little kids in their house, they are actually going batty. But I sense that we will. I mean, there's a lovely thing came out of Switzerland today, where the Swiss have said it's now okay for grandparents to hug their grandchildren as long as they're under 10. And so I think we're going to be making this up as we go along.
There's no question about it. We're organizing on the fly or building the airplane while it's in flight, whatever the phrase is. But Luigi, have you seen anything that you like with regard to allocating social distance? And then to pick up on what Joe said, have you been able to envision a way for us to continue this, but with more of us pouring out onto the streets? Now, Joe is in Toronto. Where are you today?
I'm in Toronto as well.
Toronto as well.
And, you know, for me, what has been really interesting about this whole experience is how quickly it accelerated trends that have been kind of been developing, but been delayed. Like the whole trend to telepresence. Back in 2000, I had developed a telepresence platform just like Zoom. And yet, you know, it took over 20 years for it to actually become really accepted. And it took a pandemic for people to really want to use this kind of platform. And this platform is a new virtual public realm. And I think, you know, it has its deficiencies. It's not perfectly designed as a public realm. So when we're dealing with our students, we are able to impart the education, but we haven't created those social spaces for them to, you know, talk after class the way they would do in our lobbies and our study spaces and our public spaces. So in one sense, the digital realm needs to be accelerated and the different aspects of it need to be built because it's becoming an increasingly significant part of our public realm. And on the other hand, you know, I've been looking out my window and I live in a very busy street called Davenport Street, and it's usually so noisy. And I'm really loving living on that street now without automobile noise or pollution. And so, you know, how would I like that street to look after the transition? I'd never want it to have the level of traffic that it used to have. You know, can we really reimagine how we're living so that we can reimagine that street, maybe with, you know, automated vehicles along it, with that are quieter and that are electric? Can we have more space for bikes, more space for people to walk? I think now is like a really good moment to make decisions and to see the positive places we're being accelerated to and actually pick up and continue them versus just going back to the old normal, which, you know, wasn't so great in some cases.
That's true. You know, I didn't realize how much I missed the sound of my garbage truck in the morning grinding on 69th Street. After it came back for a few days, I didn't miss it anymore. But to your point, Luigi, I just wanted to pick up on that and then throw it over to John and Ibby. There are unintended consequences, and we're seeing them in spades. This is cause and effect on steroids to some extent. Is that what's going to, for you in your mind, pick up the next idea going forward? Are you saying, you know, I like this quiet. I think I can design this quiet now in a busy city like Toronto? Is that how it's going to work?
I think it really gives us pause and should make us think about that. Just like, you know, I've been communicating with my in-laws, and they're in tall buildings, and those tall buildings don't have exterior spaces, and they've been suffering much more than we have in our home. And so, you know, it's you know, it really makes me think, like, are we designing our high-rise buildings in the right way? Should they have much more external private space? Should they have communal spaces broken up through the building so that they are more like neighborhoods within a high-rise building. So it really does expose certain frailties in the system that we have and how we might want to reimagine and design them differently. Right now, our high-rise buildings are basically, as McLuhan called them, basements in the sky. And is that what we really want? Is that what really promotes health, you know, in crisis and in non-crisis times?
Yeah, John, I'm going to throw it over to you. You've been looking at a lot of the innovations that have started to come from social distancing. Again, we'll keep it in Toronto before we go to San Francisco. Anything there that our cities who are watching this should be thinking about?
Yeah, so what's happening in a number of cities that I've been investigating is from the point of view of the public realm, we're seeing things like in Lithuania, Vilnius is now turning over its streets to public cafes for the whole summer to try and get people to come back out. You're seeing in Copenhagen and Milan, you're seeing it in Paris, you're seeing streets that are being turned over so that people can bike, they can cycle, pedestrians can walk around, they can put cafes in those spaces. Even in Toronto, where it's been a little bit more difficult to get that to happen, the city has decided that it's going to put bollards out in front of grocery stores where people are lined up trying to separate themselves by 6 feet. And yet the sidewalks are not wide enough to allow people to pass by. So now they're being forced to go out onto the street. This is not a planning piece of work. This is something that just came from the top down. So we're beginning to see regulations in communities start to break down where people are making these kinds of decisions. It's not a planning effort at all. In other areas, we're looking at what is happening in the buildings. As you know, after the Spanish flu, designers started to look at buildings and change the way in which the lobby space and the concierge area was designed. Much bigger, hallways were much bigger. They even put balconies on all of the buildings at that time. Things begin to reflect the pandemics, better sewage systems and health systems that are evolved, communities that are beginning to build healthier buildings. We need to start to look at that. Density can come in a lot of different forms. Look at the way buildings are built in places like Barcelona, even in the Plateau district of Montreal, 3-4 story buildings, but much denser than even in New York City. And this issue of density being your enemy, as we heard from your governor, Andrew Cuomo, we heard that we need to think differently about density. Well, density, yes, we need to start to think in more ethical terms, but density is not such a bad thing, even during a pandemic. So we need to think about it in a more rational terms. Well, how do we create built form that's healthier? How do we ensure that because of the density, we're able to afford things like restaurants and cafes at the lower levels, the retail stores, kind of streetscapes that we want, but also be able to afford transit, local activities, and maybe that density also goes into neighborhoods where you're able to have a more hyper-local effect that occurs. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but these are the kinds of things that many communities, not just Toronto, but many communities around the world are beginning to look at.
And we'll get back to the subject of density. I want to ask each of you about that because I think, again, that's going to be sort of the relevant point of departure for cities going forward, because it was Dr. Roth that I quoted. We need to rebuild trust in the idea of density. All of this ultimately comes down on the side of, or in the category of resilience. And I'm going to shortly refer to that great article you wrote comparing the data run that you did in the Bay Area and New York on COVID cases. But, as you're listening to these guys, how are you thinking about resilience with regard to social distancing, reimagining density, where you are? You're in San Francisco today, right?
That's right. I'm in the Bay Area.
Yeah. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, Yeah, I think that there's, we're talking about post-COVID. Maybe I'm very much in the real time in a sense, and how are we going to help people get back to work? And that's where my thinking is really focused. And so, some of the things that we're thinking about is, when can you go back to work? When should you go back to work? And then once you do go back to work, what are the different ways we can help employers, employees, and so on feel safe and confident and productive when they're doing that. So some of the things that we're thinking about, and you can couch this in resilience if you want, is to think about one, can we use, you mentioned the article that we published in Medium. We're doing a lot of forecasting and modeling. We can use that information to estimate or forecast the number of people in a community that are currently infected, or how many will be infected in a few weeks, or so on. So if we know the prevalence of the virus, we can understand how safe it might be for someone to go back to work. And then once we're back at work, we're talking about building design, things like HVAC systems. How can we get better airflow through the building? We're talking about social distancing using certain tools. We call them agent-based models, that basically show how different people interact with each other. So we could actually model train stations and airports and building lobbies to understand how people might interact with each other, especially in light of the social distancing rules or the 6-foot sphere. We can also assess the impacts on wait times, for example, as you're going through, let's say, security checkpoints, if you're trying to adhere to those social distancing measures. And that could be used for planning, basically, for the post-COVID world, let's say, and it will have a dramatic impact on how we operate some of these venues.
It's very interesting because, again, I know ARUP for a couple of years now, and you guys always tend to think of this in a holistic way. Mm-hmm. And you've just gone through that again. Mm-hmm. When you're dealing with something as complex as COVID or post-COVID as well, and you think about density and all of the things that you just categorized, where do you begin? Where's the entry point for that sort of redesign or that reimagining?
Well, I think you just mentioned the holistic piece is pretty critical, and that's how we approach resilience, risk and resilience for any type of hazard. Pandemic is another hazard. We look at all sorts of catastrophic events in my line of work, whether that's hurricanes or earthquakes or so on. So pandemic in some ways is new to us, but in many ways, it's what we've been preparing for a long time. We help organizations understand their risks, how to prepare for those risks, and what they can do to mitigate those risks, and looking at it from a cost-benefit point of view. So when you say, where do you start, it's overwhelming, isn't it? And so that's where I'm kind of thinking of this kind of as a playbook, in a sense of, right now we're all sitting at home and we're lucky, right? A lot of us can telework, but a lot of people are unlucky, or their business models can't support working from home. And those especially need to consider the second wave of infection, right? And so if you're going to remobilize an entire restaurant, service staff and inventory and so on, well, what can you anticipate when that second wave is? That's another thing that we're looking at. But I think at this moment in time, it's when can you get back to work? It's not, and sorry, it shouldn't be can you, when should you? Because the government, in different states, they're lifting in some states right now. And that's not that's not a good idea. We know that that's going to increase the prevalence of the virus and put a lot of people at risk. And the risks here are quite high, as we know, and relative to some of the other daily activities that we all do, like commuting in a car, it's many, many times higher in terms of the risk of being hospitalized or dying from COVID. So those are the things that we're considering right now. But I agree, it is a holistic approach that we should take. Some organizations might just want to focus on, let's say, getting a building back to work, but we want to look at the whole thing from start to finish.
Right, and of course you alluded to something really important, which is the essential workers, right? They really do need to be protected. We've got 2,500 transit workers infected in New York. We've got 2,000 police officers, 68 dead transit workers. These are men and women who just wanted to keep the trains running and to keep us moving. We're as you say, we're going to have to accommodate that. And in Texas, yeah, they've reopened, but they're only letting 25% of the people into theaters. Mm-hmm. So it is, you're looking at this, I think, in a bigger and broader way to get people back to work, and I think that's the right thing to do. Joe, when it comes to that issue of trust, there's fewer people who should be willing to trust the system anymore than the essential workers. And yet, as Ibby was saying, we're going to have to redesign for them. With regard to density, how can you design to reestablish trust? Is there actually a way to do that?
I think this is kind of there are two central issues here, I think. First is that the density we've got is the density that we've got in every city that we're in. I mean, the cities change incredibly slowly. 1% of the built area changes every year or something like that. So as Ibby's saying, retrofit is essentially the strategy you have you got to figure out how you can make the existing city work. The big worry that I have, that I think just I don't know what the way forward in terms of trust, because I think you can build the trust up in the workplace, and you can sort of see the trust being built up in restaurants and street life. Transit is the thing that really worries me, because here I am, I go to work, but I am jammed in on that car at 9 o'clock in the morning, and 8:30 in the morning, it's packed. I am not going to do that. And I think you're going to see the density in the big cities depends upon that transit provision. And you're going to see an awful lot of people voting not to do that. Now, what are they going to do? They're going to work from home. A lot of them can. But the essential workers are putting themselves hugely at risk, because they're usually lower paid, and they're going to hospitals which are in the central city. And whether you can do that with a huge PR campaign of putting out images of everybody cleaning every car every night, whether you can have a heat screening of everybody going into the subway station, but this is going to have to be where you push the marketing out way ahead of almost what is necessary here, because otherwise we could have a big turnaway. And every transit system in North America, anywhere in the world really, operates on such slim margins that a drop even of 10% in their passenger volumes could be close to fatal. And I think we're going to be looking at, my sense is we're going to be looking at losses much more significant than that even.
Yeah, in New York, our transit system is already running a deficit. We're basically carrying essential workers, nurses and doctors to work. Luigi, can you elaborate on that further? I mean, Joe is saying, yeah, we're going to have a very good communications plan from our cities and transit authorities and others as we rethink this. But, if I'm hearing Joe correctly, he's articulating what a lot of us are thinking, which is, I don't think I'm going to get on that subway until there's something different here to reestablish my trust. Is that fair, or is there an idea that will offset that fear?
I think the transit issue is one of the major issues. I sit on the board of the Provincial Transit Authority Metrolinx, which is really the regional transportation provider in the Greater Toronto Hamilton region. And our system is experiencing, I think, about $90 million a month loss of revenue. Yeah. And our systems in Canada are extremely dependent on customer revenue, because they've been very efficient and they've been delivered in a way without a lot of government subsidy. So, we're in discussions about, the right kind of marketing campaigns that will be needed to convince people to, come back and use the systems. But we've also been looking at other issues like, what happens if the city does start to decentralize? Like, I think as people have experienced the the advantages of telepresence and telecommuting, I think it's starting to reorient and make people open to the possibility that everything doesn't need to be so spiky, so in the downtown, that you might actually have a coordinated decentralization, and you might have more complete communities in closer proximity to where people are living, and you might be able to disperse. And that doesn't necessarily solve the transit problem, but it does create less burden. You know, even in rebringing things back into our school, we're faced, you know, into the college with the same problem. And one of the strategies is, you know, what can we really keep online so that the stuff that we're, you know, concentrating physically is distanced enough and is valuable enough for people to make the effort to come down. A lot of people are finding that they actually prefer, say, lectures online and not, you know, in auditoriums with 200 people, where they actually had less access to a teacher to ask a question, right? In theatrical performances, there have been experiments, you know, in the theater school, and people are loving being able to comment while the performance is happening through the new virtual performance. So I think it's also exposing new ways of living and new ways of being that are advantageous. But Joe's point about, you know, the financial viability of the transit systems, unless there's government intervention, is a significant one, because it may take 3 or 4 years for the confidence to build back up, or for the waves of the pandemic to be over. And so for me, I'm especially intrigued by reimagining the transit system with automated vehicles and seeing this accelerate, and looking at smaller groups of people in vehicles, a sort of more distributed transportation system rather than the packed one that we have. And like on the issue of density, I think, you know, the density's never been a problem. The problem is overcrowding and unhealth through overcrowding, right? If I, you know, think of you know, if a tall building was, if we didn't have like little corridors that go from elevators to our units, but really had like sets of social spaces that work their way through our buildings, you wouldn't have the problem that you're having right now. Because really what we've done is we've been too reductive in how we've built the density, and everything is kind of designed not as a place, but as like the way our roads are designed is a single use thing that gets you from A to B. So if we reimagine them more as like a social and public place, that is, I think, the way we need to move to be more resilient in a longer term, right? Immediately, it does present problems. And I think one of the answers is to accelerate the digital transformation.
Right, and I like the idea of a three-dimensional view of a thing like a transit system or a road, where you purpose it for other things that are more human needs as well. And I want to come back to asking each of you, what do you think we physically need in our spaces, and which can rely on technology? But John, you know, you spend a lot of time in Taiwan with our ICF Taiwan organization and our institute down in Hsinchu. The Taiwanese have gotten back on their trains, haven't they?
Well, in fact, Lou, it's really interesting. I've just spoken with them in the last couple of days, and I asked them these questions, you know, what's life like? And they said, well, very few cases, very few deaths. What Taiwan did was they already had, you know, avian flu. They've had access to SARS and so forth. And because they don't have a direct connection to the WHO, and they don't actually trust any information coming from China, they're overly prepared. And so every time you go through customs, you're constantly being monitored. Before I left the last time I was in Taiwan on February 16th, everybody there was still checking your temperature, and, you know, every restaurant you went to, it just got more and more difficult to move around without being tested. So that preparation was very important. And one of the things that's happened as a result of that there's real trust in the system because they feel that they've been tested or they've been scrutinized. And as a result, the subways are full. I said, has anything changed? No, the subways in Taipei are full. They go to restaurants. They're cautious, but they do go to restaurants, and nothing has actually closed down in the same way as it's happened here. So that is an interesting side to think about.
It is, and of course we did an interview with Emma, who runs the ICF Institute, and there was a sense that they trusted the government. The government had done right by them, and so therefore, trust is a human emotion as much as anything else. And if you do right by me, I'll do right by you, and that seemed to be in motion as well. Ibby, I wanted to just, first of all, give you a chance to comment on this aspect if you'd like. And then I wanted to move on to another area of trust right now, which is the data that we're looking at with regard to COVID, because you can have different opinions, but you only have one set of data, and you just did a very, very deep dive on COVID. But first of all, do you want to comment on the density and trust issue?
Well, I think I'll hit on John's point as well. I mean, I think in terms of trust, we've got to, our answer is testing more and testing widely, testing as many people as we can, because until we do that, we're not going to have confidence in going out, no matter what the government says. And, there are emerging frameworks talking about how to reopen the economy. And they, by and large, focus on testing, tracing, and the ability to isolate as the path forward. And I wholly agree with that. And that's the gist of the article that I published in Medium. That's what we found, is that testing or lack thereof was the reason for the disparity in the number of cases in New York versus, let's say, the Bay Area. And we're going to see the same thing in the second wave if we're not careful. But it's also the, it's the key, I think, to unlocking the economy. One of the reports that I read, I think it was the Roadmap to Pandemic Resilience by Harvard. There's a few others. One of them, at least, say that we should be testing, I think, up to 5 million people per day,
right,
if not more. And I agree with that. And one of those frameworks also suggests that testing can replace, by and large, social distancing. And I would agree with that. And I think that's what you're probably seeing in Taiwan. If you have confidence that we have, if you walk out of your door to a restaurant, you have a 0.0001% chance of encountering someone with the virus, that's pretty good odds, and you're going to go out to that restaurant. You might be more cautious than normal. I think that's the key until we find therapeutics or a vaccine.
I agree. I think you got to like those odds. It's about the same as, most guys going on trying to get a date in New York. So it just doesn't. But, I want to just, pick up on that. Your article in Medium magazine, which I would advise, is titled "The Calm, the Storm, and Then the Hope." And you had some surprising results when you did the data scrape and crunch between the Bay Area and New York. And of course, testing was one issue. Was there anything else that you found that might lend itself to a more advisory discussion about resilience going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we found was that testing or lack thereof masked the real situation on the ground. So when we talk about the calm, what we're really talking about is that between those two regions, basically the testing was saying the same thing. There was a certain number of people, it wasn't that many, that were testing positive, but at least in New York, it masked what we call the storm. It was like, it was really, the virus at that point was prevalent throughout the community. And we provide some numbers in the article about how many we think were infected at the time. There was only 100 confirmed cases, for example. And by that point, it was almost too late. And by then, days matter. And because, and you could say the Bay Area got lucky, it wasn't as prevalent, but at the same time, Governor Newsom and the mayors in the Bay Area counties acted quite quickly and aggressively, and they were accused of overreacting, at the time, because the testing only said it was not a big deal at the time. What we found in New York versus the Bay Area is that the density might matter. I mean, it's not definitive, but we do have reason to believe that something called the reproduction number, the basic reproduction number, was higher in New York. The basic reproduction number is the number of people that a person goes on to infect on average. And so based on our calculations, and there's some uncertainty here, in the Bay Area, we think the number was around 2.4, and in New York, just over 3. And when you have a exponential growth rate, that's a big deal. So when it's left unchecked, you had the prevalence spreading throughout New York City before measures were taken. In the Bay Area, you had similar, but the growth rate was slower. And so can that be due to density? It could be. We can't be definitive about it, but I think that does suggest that it does have a role to play as a big factor.
Yeah.
Can I jump in just a bit on there, maybe?
Please.
Because I'm stunned by the fact that the death rate, which is ultimately the stat that we are about, the death rate in Canada is a fifth that in the United States or the United Kingdom. I mean, just dramatically different. We started up reasonably quickly after the Bay Area, but before New York City. But that's not the reason. The reason is essentially two things, I think. One is there was enormous public trust in government. I mean, there's a silly old tagline about Canada that instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we have peace, order, and good government. And
we Americans say, who needs that stuff?
Who needs that stuff? Well, man, when you need it, you need it. The second is the very strong functioning public health system. So essentially, the virus in Canada is a virus in long-term care institutions. I mean, that is it. It is not outside that at all. And so we talk so much about the physical quality of our cities and density. I honestly think that's a pretty minor thing. The real thing is, do we have the social infrastructure to run a caring, equitable society? Yeah. And that's, you see in Germany, clearly that's the other most successful, basically Canada and Germany are the outliers. And Australia and New Zealand are wonderful, but they're a million miles away. And it's because they've got that institutional base and that cultural base.
Well, Joe, let's unpack that a little bit. I would tend to agree with you. You get into the social sciences here, and you get into culture. Mitigation. Frankly, I was reading John Barry's book. He wrote the book about the epidemic, and he said mitigation is the most brutal technique that you can ever apply. He said it should never actually. Fundamentally, he says it should never get to that point. So, to avoid that, and again, to reestablish these levels of trust in lieu of having the perfect public health system, is there a way that you can build a sense of public health and trust into the physical plant, so to speak, of a city or a neighborhood?
Well, I'd be interested on others on this. I think you can. I mean, I think, oddly, this is where gated communities and exclusively segregated communities actually act to their own disadvantage. Because in fact, it's all of the health, or all of the workers and the domestics and the other folks who are actually the people who tend up being the virus carriers. So a much more open, equitable society, I think, is much more, and particularly if you look in Singapore. Singapore is perfect, other than for the immigrant workers. So an equitable society, I think, just has a lot more resilience inherently.
Luigi, in lieu of, again, having an equitable society that you can point to in a year from now or something, I mean, what types of things can be done to accomplish some of those goals? Because I have to be honest, I truly worry about the effects of mitigation psychologically on the population of New York. I mean, New York is a place, I mean, I can't wait to shake somebody's hand. I can't wait to go and hug my doorman and talk baseball again. I think that's going to have a traumatic effect. And so, the question is, and Joe and Ibby also raises it, what do we do in the near term to sort of rebuild that sort of ethical framework that allows us to conduct business together, that allows us to embrace each other emotionally? Is that even a fair question to ask?
It's certainly an interesting one. I want to bring up, based on Joe's previous comment, the example of Cuba. One of the places that's been dealing most successfully with the pandemic is Cuba. But they had an interesting medical system that's based on a decentralized model with local healthcare in communities, right? And so when it came to it, they even were sent over to Italy to help them deal with the pandemic. So oddly, you can learn from the strangest places that you would thought that you would never learn anything from necessarily, actually have maybe something to teach. And I think the low-cost decentralized model of healthcare that has been developed in Cuba is something that maybe all of our advanced healthcare systems can learn from, right? And so the answers to complex questions like this are also maybe to be found in unusual places. For me, I think in the Canadian context, I think the biggest.
Luigi, can I just interrupt you for a second? What
Sure.
What is it about the Cuban system that you're observing that, again, we could go down there and bring it back and say, you should be thinking about this and implementing it in your.
Well, they have rather than having centralized hospitals, they do have those. They have decentralized health centers with local doctors in every community, serving like a cluster population, something that we haven't really done that well. Like, we've been busy amalgamating our hospitals, centralizing them, and making mega hospitals that are places for infection to breed. And if you think of our long-term care systems, we've been doing a similar thing. Rather than thinking about how to let people age in community, age in place, looking at making a more complete ecosystem around a neighborhood so that people can stay and age in a neighborhood. We've been building these sort of warehousing of seniors, right? So I think there are a lot of ethical questions about distribution of resources and access to resources that are, being exposed during this pandemic. There's a wonderful email that I got from Italy about a psychologist there, Morelli, who was, showing everything that was being exposed by the pandemic. Like, we didn't believe in that, climate change would really get us until we saw, the lack of pollution and how much it immediately improved, our air and our health, right? We didn't, really believe in the importance of equity that much. We didn't even value our healthcare workers and our first protectors, and look at how critical they are to us. So it's these kind of understandings, and we've talked about smart cities, but like actually how can we use that kind of smartness to start solving a lot of these problems? I think that's a big question and a big moment for us. So like what we're working on, and we're working with colleagues in New York and Milan, et cetera, is we've been doing something called Future Ways of Living. We did it in Milan in 2015, where we looked at our societal systems and tried to redesign them. I think right now is like a perfect moment to start reflecting. How should education be done differently? How should healthcare be done differently? How should work be done differently? How should culture be done differently? How should transportation and our food supply be done differently? Think of what this is exposing about our food supply, right? So, a lot of the fragility of our system is exposed. And if we're truly to make it more resilient, we need to rethink how we structure it.
Absolutely. And my mom would say the Lord works in mysterious ways. All of a sudden, we've got ducks paddling down the Grand Canal who can see all the way to the bottom. Well, that may have an awakening of sorts. I agree with you. And it's interesting. We just did one of these with Giulio Verdini, who did a big UNESCO study in rural China Stu's there for about 6 years and talked about culture in China. But, he said in southern Italy, one of the reasons they haven't been hit so hard is because they have the structure, Luigi, that you just described. They don't institutionalize their families. And there is a different type of structure that we would call old-fashioned, but again, to your point, offers us lessons. John, a more distributed approach, is that going to be one of the things we find coming out of this for our intelligent communities or our communities in general?
I would hope that we'll have thoughtful reflection that will develop those sorts of things in communities all around the world. But I fear that, we may become complacent after so many years of becoming more comfortable and confident that the systems will be okay. I think that it would be great if we could not only go through this period of rescue and recovery with the kinds of ideas that we've talked about here today, but we have a lot of limited resources, and they're even becoming more depleted now. So what can we do with the economy that's there and today, and we're going to have to spend to get into a better place as we move forward? What are we going to spend it on? Are we going to put them into bus systems as opposed to subways to distribute people differently? Are we going to focus on a hyper-local situation, not only for retail, but for health systems and so forth? Or are we going to fall back into the same sort of pattern that we exhibited before this all happened? So this reimagining is really important, and maybe it will actually stick. If there's a way for us to move forward and actually have some things stick, I think that would be the best thing I can see coming out of this. But the people that are really going to suffer are the vulnerable. We recognize that they're there now because they're more exposed. We have heard a lot of horror stories about some of the homeless. Normally, when there are a lot of people around, they become anonymous. They're invisible. But now I think we really need to take some effort to accommodate thinking around how to deal with the disenfranchised, the vulnerable, the people who are homeless and in shelters. Others that are considered forgotten in prisons and in seniors' homes and so forth. Not a lot of thought is given to those people. It's sort of secondary in our planning processes. And maybe now is a time to kind of recognize that our frontline workers, our grocery store clerks, all these others should be paid a proper wage, and that it sticks later on. So ideas about creating distributed new ideas, yes, I hope that we can look at it, but I wouldn't want to see that go into the issue of distribution to a flight to the suburbs and a flight to urban and rural areas that,
because they'll need to change as well, won't they? They'll need to change.
Absolutely. So, I think we need to have structure around how we think about these things and have some real thoughtful leadership in this kind of discussion moving forward.
Yeah.
Can I dare offer?
Please.
Can I dare offer an optimistic thought? One of the things that I'm fascinated by is the new forms of art that are coming out, and classically, or not classic. It's funny to use that, but what you're seeing now is these multi-person sing-songs. Or the Rolling Stones, living in a ghost town, but typically it'll be every street busker in Dublin. They just did a beautiful one from Dublin. There was a lovely one done in Toronto here, and I'm sure these are popping up all over the world. And art will find a way. Art will burst out through these barriers, and I think it's certainly the stuff that Luigi is doing, I suspect, on this score. Where can we sign up to a virtual choir every Friday night? Downright, we'll be able to do that now, and I think this Zoom thing has got its disadvantages, but oddly, it's got some advantages to it as well. And so we are into new territory. But one thing we know about every pandemic is it's produced some new wave of art.
Absolutely. And, I opened our discussion here by quoting
Yes.
Mr. Tomasini. So I think that's quite appropriate. But as you say, it will depend on technology. And Ibby, as we close here, ARUP has a terrific reputation for its digital technology and strategy group. Where do you see technology fitting into this framework that we've begun to define today? And how can it contribute to a more resilient social index, which I think is in many ways going to be either job 1 or 2 after we go to work?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but I think I just want to go back to a couple of points that were made. I mean, I think that, this is disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable. And it's what we've seen in every other hazard that we've studied over the many years. And what we've found also is that people don't act to make things better until something is right on their doorstep. So sometimes we say it'd be nice to have an earthquake that gets people riled up, so they'll do something. We see hurricanes every year, so it's more likely to do something there. But one of the things that we need to be careful of is being, as designers especially, is to overwhelm people with, we should do this, 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 and this. It's very difficult for people to grasp how much we might need to do to address this. So I think we need to identify the low-hanging fruit, if you will, and start to implement those, the low cost items, and give people some easy wins in a sense. And that's what we've done over the years for many different types of hazards. In terms of technology, you're right, we do have a great digital technology group here. I think in terms of what we're doing, helping forecast risks and understanding how that might impact, when you should or should not go back to work, for example, is one thing. Our team in East Asia is working on thermal imaging using AI and using cameras to do that, but also things like contact tracing through mobile apps. I think that's going to be key really for us, again, to get this ability to reopen the economy, to test more people, to trace, to isolate, and so on, so that we don't necessarily have to change the entire world in the next 6 months, but we can hopefully reopen and make these changes that we've been talking about, and maybe reimagine our behavior. So you might not be able to necessarily, go hug your doorman, but maybe we shouldn't be flying all across the world to this conference and this conference and this conference, because, Mother Earth is telling us, hey, everyone calm down, let's breathe a little bit, right? And I think we're all seeing that. We're all seeing with a bit more clarity, what are the important things in life.
Yeah, and I think that's a nice way to close it. To just about everybody's point, I think Luigi also evoked it. Let's learn from it. We're given a lesson here. We're given a nice new canvas with a whole new set of colors to paint from, and it's up to you guys to sort of build it for us as the new normal. So I'd like to thank all 4 of you. We're out of time, and I've still got a million questions, but thanks for starting us off on our discussion about the new abnormal. Many thanks to ICF Canada for their support. To learn more about ICF Canada, go to icf-canada.com, and you can find out other brilliance that's going on north of the border here where Ibby and I are. The No Place But Home series is produced by ICF as a service to its network of intelligent communities around the world. I want to give a special shout out to our producer, Matt Owen, and please join us next week for another conversation. To view this conversation, which will be online shortly, and others from places like Taiwan and Tallinn, Estonia, and South Dakota, go to intelligentcommunity.org/COVID-19. And you can follow us on Twitter at New Communities. I am Lou Zaccarella on behalf of ICF and my colleague John Young, reminding you that there really is no place like home.